Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 15 of season 2 of the She Is Unleashed podcast. I am your host, Dr. Mirriam Knight, and I am so excited to have you with me here today as we go into today's topic, confronting failures and unveiling growth through setbacks. This is a very personal one for me, and we're going to talk about something that we've all experienced, but a few of us like to confront, which is the concept of failure. Now, whether it's a career setback, a relationship that didn't turn out the way we hoped for, a personal goal we fell short of, failure can feel like a heavy weight on our hearts. But what if I told you that failure isn't the end? That in fact, failure is often the birthplace of growth. I'm going to say that again. Failure is often the birthplace of growth if we allow God into those spaces of failure. In this episode, we're going to confront our failures, not with shame or guilt, but with grace and understanding that God uses every setback to grow us, refine us, and prepare us for the next step in our journey. So if you've ever felt defeated by failure, or if you're in the middle of a setback right now, this is for you. Let's dive in together and uncover the beauty that lies in the midst of our failures. Now, let's start by redefining what failure actually is. Too often, we see failure as a setback, right? We see it as the end of the road, a sign that we weren't good enough, that we missed our shot, or that maybe we weren't called to do what we thought we were. But here's the truth: failure is not final. Failure doesn't define who you are. It's simply part of the process. It's a detour, not a dead end. And here's the thing, often it is in those places of failure that God gets the most glory out of our story. Now, I want to share a personal story from my own journey. In my own life, I've had several moments where I've experienced failure. The first one that stands out for me was when I was doing my Form C in Lesotho, Southern Africa, and I failed. And I remember the day the results came out, wanting to hide and not wanting to get out of bed. And this was the first time I had experienced failure of any kind, per se. And then just relationship failures that I experienced, moments when I planned events and I failed, when things didn't go the way I thought they should. Worship experiences that I hosted with some of my good friends and business partners, and the budget was so much in the negative, and literally our expenses required us to pull out of our own pockets. Many times where I had poured my soul and my heart into something, into a project, into a person. Now, the greatest setbacks in my life and moments of failure were not the events or business experiences or ministry experiences per se, but the relationships, friendships, interactions with people where I prayed so hard, worked so hard, had so many high hopes for where the relationship would go or how we would navigate certain things, or even that specific person, how I thought they would turn out and what their journey would look like. And it did not turn out the way I expected. I felt crushed when people that I loved and I really cared about made decisions that I felt, and I'm going to highlight this. I can say this now, after years and years of not getting it, right? But I can say this now when people that I love made decisions or navigated situations in a way I didn't think they should. And I felt like they were going to hurt themselves and they were going to end up in a really bad situation. Those things hurt me more than any business thing. I could always deal with the setbacks of finances or challenges in every other area, but relationships, because people are so close to my heart, those hurt me the most. When things did not turn away the way I wanted them to or thought they should, I felt crushed to my core. Like, I feel things so deeply. I don't know about you, but I'm an empath at heart. So I feel things so deeply. And when people are going through situations and they make bad choices, I personally feel the crush and the break when they're going through a rough time, when their hearts are broken, when they experience setbacks and failures. I take that so personally, or I used to take that, and I am learning. God is teaching me how to relinquish that attachment to that situation. I would question myself, especially when you've maybe given a prophetic word to someone or you've seen visions and dreams, or you've given guidance as a leader, or where you've shared vision and strategy and it does not work out the way you thought it should or you wanted it to. I remember starting a nonprofit organization under my company, Destiny Connections, and it was Destiny Connections Foundations. And I had such great hopes and ideas of where it would go and how it would turn. And I still believe that God will maybe do that someday again. But here's the thing, in those moments where I had to shut it down and close it down, I felt like a failure. I felt like, did I really hear God? Did I miss something? Did I fail? I felt that it was the end of something that was so important to me, that was part of my being. Y'all, if you know me, you know that when I dream, my heart is always about people. When I have hopes and dreams and desire, it has always been about people and impacting the world and impacting nations. So when something fails, in any regard, I take it very personally as a personal failure, that maybe I missed God, maybe I missed his direction, maybe I did something wrong, even in relationships. So what I learned in this process, that even though the experience was hard and painful, and some of those situations I'm still living in right now, that failure is not a reflection of my worth. It doesn't make me unworthy. It doesn't make me stupid. It doesn't make me a failure. It doesn't make me um less worthy simply because things did not turn out the way I thought they should, I thought they would. God wasn't using that setback to define me. He was using it to refine me. He was teaching me lessons that I couldn't have learned any other way. Lessons about perseverance, trust, and humility. When I look back, I realized that failure wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something greater. But I know this, and check this out. I truly understand that when you're in it, in the midst of it, it does not feel like it. When you can't see beyond what you're feeling and experiencing right now, it can be so hard to not feel like this is the end. This is the end of the story. And it can be so crushing and so breaking. In Romans 8, verse 28, and we say the scripture often, a verse that brings me comfort, and I hope it brings you comfort too. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and those who have been called according to his purpose. I think sometimes we forget and we lose sight of what good is, and that ultimately at the end of the day, God is more interested in us becoming who he desires for us to be, and he will use our failures and our setbacks to shape us and mold us into his image and his likeness. He takes what we see as failures and uses them for our growth and his glory. He uses them to stretch us and to test us and to try us and see what is really in our hearts. What's the condition of our thought life, our emotional life, our physical life, the nature of our relationships. God uses failures and setbacks to challenge us, to stretch us, and to literally bring out of us that which is not of him and that which is of him. He desires to see glory come out of our lives. But for some of us, no, for all of us, this process has to include a time of refining and purification. Now, when you remember that God is working in your life, even when it doesn't feel like it, even when you don't see it, even when it feels like this is the worst of worst situations, and you may literally feel like you're dying, you begin to see that failure is part of the journey, not the end. If you think about the stories of Thomas Edison, who discovered light and electricity and all those wonderful things, we know this. He tried 10,000 times and he failed every single time, failed. But the rephrasing and the reframing of that mindset is no, he just learned 10,000 ways that did not work. It was, there's a test and a trial of that doesn't work, that doesn't work. I'm going to try this. And you keep trying and you don't give up until you see the end result that you are looking for. A lot of times in our pursuit of vision, in our pursuit of dreams and hopes and aspirations, we feel like we're entitled to a just one try and we've won. But that's not the way of life for all of us, most of us. It's 1 in a million, 1 in a zillion that will try it the first time and get it right the first time round. A lot of us have to go through processes of testing and trial until we figure out what works. So I want to ask a question, and I invite you to take a moment to pause right now. Hit pause on the podcast and just take a moment to ask yourself, where in your life have you allowed failure to define you? What would it look like if you shifted your perspective and instead saw this space, the space where you failed, whether it's a relationship, a business venture, your health, um, your diet, your relationships with people, your finances, that dream, that nonprofit, that book, whatever it is that you have attempted and it feels like a failure. What would it look like if you shifted your perspective from seeing it as the end of the road and instead seeing it as an opportunity for growth instead? So take a moment right now and think about it. What is that area of your life where you've allowed failure to define you? And what would a shift in perspective do for you right now? Now, the second component of this is for us to be able to recognize that the most powerful thing about failure is that it teaches us lessons that we may never have learned if everything had gone smoothly. Failure has a way of bringing clarity about ourselves, about our calling, and even our relationship with God. It humbles us, but it also strengthens us. There is nothing like failure and if you keep on trying, that's the key part. If you don't give up in the midst of failure, failure will bring so much clarity into your life. You know that's a definite no. You know that that's a door that you've gone through, you've explored it, and you know that's a definite no. I'm going to close that door. I'm not going to go through that again. If we learn the lesson, it's so important that we learn the lessons in our experiences of failure, lessons that we don't learn, lessons that we don't confront and embrace. We have a tendency of repeating over and over again because God is this concerned about us that He will take us through the class over and over again until we get it, because He will not promote us to the next level if we don't have the capacity and we don't have the lessons learned from our failures to carry us into the next season of our lives. Now, I know there was a time in my own life, right? I've learned the greatest lessons of failure in my own experiences in my own life. There was a time when I felt like I had let everyone down, including myself. I remember this being especially in the relationship that I had before my husband. Before I met my husband, I felt like a failure. I had truly thought that I had heard the voice of God, that this was it. This was what God had set aside for me, that He had called for me, and yet everything was falling apart. In the process of that journey, I hurt my parents, I hurt myself, I hurt people that I really cared about because I was so determined that I was going to make this work. Now, here's the thing. I learned about, in those moments of failure, I learned so much about grace. I learned so much about mercy. Learned so much about the love of God and the forgiveness of God. There was a humility that God developed in me that I would not have developed anywhere else. See, I was so self-righteous. I was so high and mighty. I thought I had it all figured out. I would look down my nose on everybody else. I thought I was better. I don't know. It was messed up. Like, there was so much that God had to allow me to go through to literally crush me and break me and humble me and bring me to the place where I recognize that the righteousness that I had, the holiness that I had, it was not of my own, that it was completely and fully dependent on God and what God had done for me, not anything that I had done for myself. In those moments when I felt like I had let everyone down, God spoke to my heart. In my moments of brokenness, that's where He found me. He reminded me that my worth wasn't tied to my success, and that sometimes failure is the very thing that brings us closer to Him. See, God had to show me that I was relying too much on myself. I was relying too much on my intellect and my abilities. I was relying too much even on my relationship with Him. And God had to teach me that it is in my place of brokenness, in my place of what felt like a failure, that God's grace was enough. That even when I fall short, His grace is able to lift me up. In 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, God says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Think about that. God's power is made perfect in our weaknesses. That means even when we fail, even when we don't have it all together, God's strength is working in us. It's in those moments of failure that we see His grace more clearly and we grow in ways we've never imagined. I remember thinking over and over again that I had let myself down. I was so embarrassed and so full of shame that I had allowed myself to be in this very space, in this very spot that I had taught so many other young women and so many other young people to avoid and not go to. I was literally a paradox of what I had taught and what I had claimed and proclaimed to other people and taught for so many years. I felt like a huge failure morally, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. I could not understand how I had allowed myself to get to this place. To even be in the position that I was in, but God's love and His mercy and His grace that found me in that place, y'all. I have never felt the love of God and the grace and the forgiveness and the mercy of God like I did in my moments of failure, in my moments of weakness, in my moments when I felt like I was unworthy and undeserving. His love and His grace and His mercy found me in those places and pulled me literally out of the muck. I remember going into spaces of deep depression as I navigated, as I thought about where I was and how messed up my life was and how messed up I was mentally, emotionally, spiritually, relationally. I had burnt so many bridges. I had hurt so many people because of my own choices. And I remember God saying to me, this does not define you. This is not the end of the story. I'm not done with you yet. We have not even begun. We haven't touched the surface of what I want to do in and through your life. Now, I want to ask you, sis, what lesson is God trying to teach you through your current or past failures? Or maybe you haven't failed. I don't know. Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat. Let me know how God has been teaching you about failure, how God has been teaching you about embracing His grace in the midst of your failures and seeing your failures not as the end of the road, but as an opportunity for growth and development. Take some time to reflect on how God has used setbacks in your life to draw you closer to Himself and to refine you and purify you for something greater. See, the next level that God is calling you to, you cannot rely on your own wisdom and your own intellect and your own ability. It is going to require a higher level of dependence on God and God's righteousness and God's worthiness and God's holiness for you to be able to step into what God is calling you to next. Now, the third component that I want us to talk about is how do we embrace God's grace in the midst of our failures? One of the hardest things about failure is a temptation to beat ourselves up, to spiral into shame, or to feel like we'll never recover. See, here's what the enemy wants us to do. He wants us to stay stuck in our places of failure. He wants us to stay stuck in those places where we know we have fallen short. But check this out. The Bible says that we have all fallen short of the glory of God. There is not one person, the Bible continues to say, so that we cannot boast in ourselves, in our own abilities, but our only boast is in the Lord. Here's what I want you to hear today, sis. God's grace is bigger than your failure. His love for you doesn't change based on how well you perform. You are not a failure, even if you have failed. Now, I've had moments where I was so hard on myself after failing, especially in regard to relationships. This specific relationship where I felt I had failed myself, I failed God, I failed my family, I failed my loved ones. And it was so hard for me to forgive myself and have grace for myself after this failure. I remember thinking, how could I have messed up so badly? What if I can't fix this? What if I can't recover from this? But God, in His kindness, gently reminded me that His love for me is not dependent on my ability to get everything right. He is a God of grace, and He never expected me to be perfect, only to be faithful. That's when I learned that part of the growth process is learning to forgive yourself. And here's something else, one of our pastors said this today. We've got to learn to, in our asking for forgiveness, we've also got to pick it up. When God extends forgiveness to us, when He extends mercy to us, and we ask for his forgiveness, forgiveness has already been extended to us. We just have to pick it up. We have to make a decision not to stay in shame and guilt and condemnation. We have to learn to receive the forgiveness that God is extending towards us. It's in learning to receive that grace that we can extend the same grace that we extend to others to ourselves, so that we experience the fullness of all that God has so freely given to us. When we extend that same grace to ourselves that we often find easier to extend to other people, we start to walk in a new level of freedom. And God is definitely in this season calling us to higher lengths, higher levels of freedom. Psalm 103 verse 12 says, as far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. When God looks at you, he doesn't see your failure. He sees his beloved daughter redeemed and restored. That's the power of grace. It wipes away every mistake, every misstep, and gives us the freedom to start afresh. Sis, where do you need to extend grace to yourself today? What failure have you been holding on to that God is asking you to release so that you can move forward into freedom? Go ahead and hit pause and just give yourself permission to reflect on that right now. What is the area where you need to extend grace to yourself? What failure have you been holding on to that God is asking you to release so that you can move forward in freedom? The last component of this journey and this process is we've got to allow God to help us to turn our setbacks and our failures into setups. See, God has already done it. We just have to embrace it. What you see as failure, God sees as preparation. Your setback is actually a setup for God to move in and through your life. The thing that feels like a roadblock is often just a detour leading you to something even better. But in order to see it that way, you have to trust that God is in control, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. One of the most profound moments in my life came after what I thought was a massive failure. See, if I go back to that relationship I've been talking about, the most profound moments in my life was when I got to realize that God's plan and God's desire for me is so much bigger than my own. That what I thought was the end of the story, that this was it, I had failed so miserably in this area that I was never going to get the opportunity to experience love. I was never going to experience the opportunity to have an amazing husband, someone I could partner with, someone I could serve the Lord with, someone that I could literally see God pull glory out of us. Now, even in my careers and in business, I remember even the decisions that I made that seemed like the best thing at that moment. And I later discovered that I had made the worst move, even financially, in working towards these goals, working towards the perfect marriage, the perfect career, the perfect, whatever the perfect thing is, when it didn't pan out in the way that I thought it should. I couldn't see beyond that disappointment, that moment, that those emotions in that moment, the trauma of that moment. But looking back now, I realized that if that door, I thank God for the closed doors, y'all. I don't know about you, but I'm so grateful for the closed doors. If God had not closed that door, I would never have stepped into the greater opportunity, the greater space that God had waiting for me on the other side. I would never be in the marriage that I am right now with the amazing man of God that I get to do life with. What felt like a failure was actually God positioning me for his plan. What felt like failure was actually God positioning me for his plan. I would never have met my husband. I would never be where I am right now today if it wasn't for those closed doors and for those setbacks that I experienced in my life. In Proverbs 16, verse 9, we're reminded, in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Even when our plans fall apart, God's purpose for us remains firm. I'm going to say that again. Even when our plans fall apart, God's purpose for us remains firm. He's always guiding our steps, even through failure. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Even if I make my bed in hell, even there you will find me. It doesn't matter how bad your situation is. God is able to meet you right there where you are, and he's able to turn that situation around for your good. Listen, that failure, that setback is just setting you up for the next chapter of your life. If you will submit and surrender your life and your situation to Him. So, sis, I'm asking, what setbacks in your life might actually be a setup for something greater? Where is God asking you to trust Him in the midst of your disappointment, knowing that He's working behind the scenes for your good? See, failure is not the end of your story. It's just a chapter. And in God's hands, it doesn't matter. Maybe you thought you made the wrong choice. You made a wrong decision and you went down a wrong path. You made the worst decision possible. Maybe you're living in a space of regrets and disappointments, in a place of depression and grief of all the things that could have been. Listen, submitted to God, all our failures, all our disappointments, all our setbacks, all our regrets become a fertile ground where growth, wisdom, and purpose take root. As you go through this week, I encourage you to confront any failures you've been carrying with shame and shift those failures to recognizing the grace of God, the mercy of God, the compassion of God, the forgiveness of God, the strength of God that is available to you in the midst of whatever you may be experiencing right now. Look for the lessons God is teaching you and trust that He's using every setback as part of His plan to grow you and prepare you for what is next. This week, take some time to reflect on a past failure or setback and ask God to reveal the growth that came from it. Write down the lessons you've learned and thank Him for the way He's using every part of your journey for good. I know several moments in my life story, in my life journey, in my timeline, where those failures were pivotal moments where God shifted the trajectory of my life. If it was not for that failure, and this is post event, right? It's retrospectively. I'm looking at my life and I'm seeing that in every failure, when we're in it again, I understand that when you're in the midst of it and standing in the middle of pain and confusion and disappointment and all the emotions that come from whatever you're experiencing right now, it can be so hard to see God in the midst of this, to see good come out of your situation. But I want to encourage you. Allow God to give you revelation and insight of how your failures and your disappointments in His hands don't have to be the end of the story, but can literally be a pivotal moment where He turns that situation into a space of growth and transformation for the thing that He is wanting to do in your life. And if today's episode spoke to you at all, I'd love to hear from you. Share your story on social media using the hashtag #SheIsUnleashed. And let's keep encouraging one another as we embrace the grace that God gives us, even in the midst of failure. I want to thank you once again for joining me on this episode of She is Unleashed. If today's message encouraged you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might need to hear this truth. Remember, your failures do not define you. God's grace does. So until next time, stay blessed, stay encouraged, and stay unleashed.